Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Well, we are starting our Breakout 1. Please come in. Yeah. Okay. My name is Chuan Sheng, and together with me here are Ms. Leng and Professor Noorhaidi Hasan. We're delighted to welcome you to Breakout 1. In the morning, we had a fascinating time. President Tharman highlighted the three factors that accelerated a polarization: immigration, fragmented nature of a fragmented landscape of social media, social isolation. And he also identified solutions in 4 areas in terms of education, common spaces, regulated social media, and culture of respect. The special presentation explores perspectives on understanding social cohesion in terms of definitions, universal principles and local contexts, and goals and tools. It touches on themes of public leadership, knowledge investment, the paradox of centric management and technocracy, the cohesion of goodwill, of necessity of action, the dancing along polarities to transcend paradoxes, learning from history, and at the same time fostering creativity and innovation, and very interestingly, the metaphors of quilt, orchestra, and moral ecology. The plenary in Unpacking Multiculturalism discusses issues such as the connections between multiculturalism, inclusion, and social cohesion, the roles of significant events in shaping our thinking in multiculturalism and cohesion, and the factors that facilitate the bringing together of diverse ethnic and religious communities. There were themes of from Panchasila to Istiqlal Declaration of 2024. There's the psycho-social analysis of multiculturalism, and there's a discussion on trust, how trust impacts social cohesion and perceptions of multiculturalism. This breakout continues the discussion by focusing on 2 case studies. First, the Chinese community in Singapore, to be presented by Leng, and then Islam in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, to be presented by Noorhaidi. Allow me to now introduce the background of Leng, our first speaker. This will give you a better sense of where she's coming from when she does a presentation, and knowing her background may also give rise to interesting questions that you may have. And of course, please submit your questions to the Pigeonhole. Leng is the editor-in-chief for the Chinese media group in SPH Media. She is responsible for Lianhe Zhaobao and its global digital platform, Zhaobao.com, the evening daily Xinmin Daily News, a stable of student publications, a digital journal for young audience called Hey Kaki, and an English language e-magazine called thinkchina.sg. Leng joined SPG in 1994 and held numerous roles as a journalist, Hong Kong correspondent, Beijing bureau chief, China editor, news editor, and deputy editor of Lianhe Zhaobao. She helmed the evening daily Lianhe Wanbao from 2014 to 2016, and in December 2016, she was appointed head of the Chinese media group and was redesignated to her current role with the formation of SPH Media Trust in 2021. Leng currently serves as a member of the Founders Memorial Committee, a board director of the Esplanade Company Limited and Business China, and a board member of the Lee Kuan Yew Fund for Bilingualism. In 2025, she was appointed as a non-executive and independent director of Wilma International Limited. She received the Xing Yun Journalism Award Outstanding Achievement in 2019. On that note, may we invite Huay Leng to share with us her thoughts on the evolution of the Chinese community in Singapore.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's after lunchtime now. I know people will doze off. It's okay. Thank you for giving this opportunity to share using the Chinese community as a case study on multiculturalism in Singapore. Because of my experience and actually my participation in this community, the title or the theme of this afternoon's discussion, we start from history. So I will briefly go through what actually the Chinese community experienced, and we then ask the question is history a compass for navigation or a barrier to a more inclusive future? And this morning we heard about, I think quite a few speakers talked about the success story of multiculturalism in Singapore. I think it's important to understand the history, how some of the communities, what they went through. Some of them actually they gave up their space and strive for a better national common space in this process. So I should start with history. Before I go into the actual part of British colony, but we begin with, if we think of it, I mean, the Chinese in Singapore, actually, the starting point was they came from China. So there's this, I think we can, after I finish talking about history, we think of the current times. There's one common factor that we can think about, which is China, how it influenced the Chinese community in Singapore. But that was a different China than when the immigrants came to Singapore at that time. So the immigrants from Singapore previously, when they came in very early times, in 1830s, actually, the ethnic Chinese was already about 45%, according to an 1836 census done at that time. And it grew, and from very early times, they became the majority in Singapore, Malaya. By 1901, in Singapore, so by 1901, there were already over 70% of ethnic Chinese in Singapore. And for this one, you can see that in 1960, already it's about that composition of what we are now in Singapore. So by then, it's already about 75%, 3/4 of Singapore population being ethnic Chinese, and Malay, Indians, and others. And let's look at the outlook of the Chinese immigrants when they first came. They were called Sin-Ke, as in guests, new guests to this place in Singapore. For them, a lot of their focus actually was on China. I mean, China was their fatherland. That's where they came from. And whatever that they did in Singapore was always related to what's happening in Singapore. So they started newspapers in Singapore. They participated in the revolution in China itself. I work for Leng, which actually it's a newspaper that's merged two newspaper companies, which was founded in 1920s, and one is Nanyang Shangbao and the other is Xinzhou Ribao. They were all looking at China at that time, very much concerned with what's happening there. And within the Chinese community, actually, it's always said that there are three pillars that's important to them. One is the clans and associations that were formed. In Singapore, they formed clans and associations to help the new coming migrants in Singapore at that time, to take care of them. Then the other thing that would grow will be Chinese schools, because education to them is important. And the British government at that time, they left it to the Chinese community to run their own schools. So there were many schools established by the Chinese community itself. And the other thing would be the newspapers. So language, education, and language and culture is something that is of very important to the community. So you see the two newspapers on the right, that's the first newspaper cover of Nanyang Shangbao and Xinzhou Ribao, which in fact, for the one in the middle, the photo in the middle, on top in the center, it's actually, they published the will of Sun Yat-sen from China, and they called it the will of the premier, 总理遗嘱 at that time, yeah. So it's very much what we call a overseas Chinese newspaper, 侨报, at that time. So during and after World War II, actually, because of what's happening in China, a lot of the intelligentsia actually, some of them came, what they called it, they came south from China, so all the way to Malaya, Southeast Asia, Nanyang, as they called it. And some of them were teaching in schools, running newspapers, very active to form part of the Chinese community, in fact. So this was the number in 1949, where you can see that there are different kinds of schools and students going to school. So the Chinese community would then most of them would send their children to Chinese schools. When we say Chinese schools at that time, it's the medium of the language teaching would be in Chinese language. There were also English language schools started by the British government, of course. But the Chinese would believe that it's important to pass on their values, and they would send the kids to Chinese schools. So this was what happened in 1954. There was this riot, and I should talk about a little bit on the background. In December 1953, British colonial government passed a National Service Ordinance which required federal citizen males ages 18 to 20 to register for part-time national service. And the deadline was supposed to be 12th of May in 1954. So the Chinese school students, a lot of them would be impacted because many of them, when they went to the Chinese middle schools at that time after war, they were about that kind of age. So immediately after they've graduated from the school, they will have to do their national services. So they opposed it. I mean, there's also literature about that this was, the communists were behind this getting the students to oppose to this. And the Chinese school students, they were demonstrating and petitioning to the British government, but this peaceful demonstration turned into a clash with the government, British government at that time. Some 50 students were actually injured. Some of them were arrested by the British government. So you can see that in the Straits Times at that time, when they reported about it, it was reported as a clash. The students opposed to that. The students, they did not want to cooperate. Whereas the Chinese, the two photographs that were circulating at that time and after, actually, it was more on how the British government were treating the students. So it's different perspective at that time. But what's important is that for this incident, a person called Lee Kuan Yew was engaged as the students' lawyer and helped them to defend. He defended 7 students. So the important part is that this is how he built connections with the Chinese educated, and actually through this, gradually he gained support from the Chinese educated. And in 1959, he actually won election in Singapore to form the government. So at the same time, in 1955, there's also this establishment of a university called Nanyang University, which is now NTU, where RSIS is part of it. So it was actually started by a group of Chinese businessmen and the community. They came together to provide university education for the Chinese middle school students when they graduated, because they were not able to, because of the language, they probably couldn't get into University of Malaya. China has become communist China, they couldn't go back to China. So this was the highest level of education that the students, the Chinese educated students, could attain at that time. It's a lot of pride for the Chinese community. Also at that time, because previously, during the colonial period, the Chinese educated, or the Chinese education, Chinese schools were not very much taken care of. But after World War II, British started to pay more attention to the Chinese schools because of the influence of Malayan Communist Party during war. So in February 1956, there was this all-party committee of Singapore Legislature Assembly on Chinese education, and subsequently there was a white paper on education where they would provide, the government then would provide equal treatment to all schools, schools of different language streams. And for this one, almost all the Chinese schools then accepted this, accepted government's subsidiaries for this. Previously, they did not. Accepting subsidiaries, meaning there would be more intervention from the government, but they accepted because in mid-1955, it was quite clear that we are on this path in nation building, and the Chinese students or the Chinese schools saw themselves as part of this whole process as well, so they were more willing to accept this. So during that time, in late 1950s, early 1960s, there's this concept of nation building, we had national language, Malay as the national language. We set up national library. It's all about national, and it's very clear that we have to localize, the Chinese community understand that they have to localize. I did not mention about racial riots that happened earlier, but to the Chinese, I think, the ethnic Chinese, although they are the majority, I think they understood the sensitivity of that Singapore, it's multiracial. I think this part of it they understand, and that actually in Southeast Asia, although in Singapore they may be the majority, in Southeast Asia they are the minority, Chinese. And the second part would be that the Chinese educated also gradually saw themselves as, although being the majority, they have to step back in their language and cultural space for the expansion of a common space in Singapore. Time is running out, but I will speed up on this. So there were a lot of other things that happened in the late 1970s because the Chinese students' enrollment to Chinese schools actually had greatly deteriorated. It used to be probably from 1957 to 1967, there were about 30 to 40% of the Chinese parents that will send the children to Chinese schools, but by 1977, there were less than 14%, and when it came to 1983, actually there were less than 1%. In between that, actually, there was effort from the government to set up this special, there was this Go King Sui report at that time, to set up SAP school to retain 9 Chinese schools because they have their tradition. It was a preparation for them. It's for them to take in top ethnic Chinese students so that they can continue to do Chinese and English as a first language in school. Those who sat for their primary school living examination. Those who top in the top 8% of them can opt to join these 9 schools if they wanted. At the same time, the government also launched this Speak Mandarin campaign in 1979, because a lot of people at that time, the Chinese themselves, they were speaking in different dialects. So it's for them to speak a common language amongst themselves as well. In 1980, that university that I mentioned, the Nanyang University that was set up by the Chinese community themselves, had to merge with University of Singapore to form National University of Singapore. And this was a very bad news for the Chinese community. But there's very little that they could do at that time because enrollment indeed was falling. So it's very much Singapore at that time moving into one nation. But indeed, in 1991, there was a general election. If we look at it from today's point of view, PAP at that time, they lost 3 more seats to the opposition in the 1991 general elections. It's nothing very much, if we see it from today, 3 more seats only, but at that time it was quite a big thing to the People's Action Party. So when he analyzed it, then Deputy Prime Minister Ong Teng Cheong actually, his conclusion on why did they lose so many seats was that the so-called silent majority, he was referring to the ethnic Chinese at that time, the Chinese educated, that they were not happy with the government. They were expressing their unhappiness because they were fearful that moral standard of society will deteriorate because they felt that the Chinese language standard and the culture has deteriorated. And I quote, "It has not, as in the government has not given enough attention and care to the development of the Chinese language and culture." So the Chinese community evolved from, it was very much dialect speaking to Mandarin speaking, there's this survey that the Ministry of Education would do every year for primary 1 students to enroll, to understand what language do they speak at home. So it changed from the students were speaking, most of them at first dialects, then Mandarin, but eventually it became that most of them actually, although the mother tongue is Mandarin or their dialects, but actually most of them now speak English at home. This is the state of Singapore now, that it's very much an English-speaking society, actually. So if we look at what's happening now, when I first began, I talked about the China factor. Still today, with immigrants coming from China, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, we are getting all these ethnic Chinese immigrants, but it's a very different China that we are facing with today. A lot of them, they are now very much wealthier, and the media consumption pattern is very different. It's not that imagined community that we had at that time when media could get everybody focused on nation building. Nowadays, this morning when President talked about fragmentation of media, social media is something that they are all consuming. And although they lived in Singapore, probably the news that they are reading about, it's also from elsewhere. So it poses different challenges for us today on integrating these people. It has become, I think, one of the very important topic that we will have to look into in the coming years. So to the Chinese community, this is important of that we develop in different phases, and with government's policy, there was the national narrative at that time was that we are building a nation, and indeed people saw progress and people feel proud of what we have built, and there's mechanism in managing multiracial, multicultural, multi-religion Singapore throughout these years that we have been quite successful. And I have to say also, I think this morning Professor Colin also mentioned about the role of media in this process. Indeed, I mean, coming from the media, we know that media, we don't play up issues on religion, language, and culture. We have been very careful in reporting and commenting about this. But it may no longer be the case now that media is actually quite free nowadays. So with all this, we have been quite successful. I'm in this Founders Memorial Committee, and when we started on this project, we surveyed Singaporeans who came to the exhibitions, and a lot of them when they voted, they thought the important values of the building of Singapore is multiculturalism. That shows how successful we are over all these years. So we have to continue to do with that, but yet I think it's important also to allow space for each community to grow and develop, and for the different communities, different ethnic groups, not to see each other's development in their language and culture as a zero-sum game. So it's also that understanding that although we are Singaporeans, there's also this multi-layer identity of individuals in Singapore. I will stop here, and I can take questions later. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Huay Leng, for a very insightful account, a historical perspective of the evolution and transformation of the Chinese community in Singapore. We talk about the gaze towards China, how that gaze towards China changed from 1901 all the way to current times. We talk about the context of multiculturalism, and Huay Leng ends on the note of building an all-inclusive multiculturalism, which is also a point raised in this morning's discussion. We'll have time for more discussion on these various aspects. Now allow me to introduce our second speaker. Noorhaidi currently serves as rector of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University, Yogyakarta. Previously, he held key leadership positions, including Dean of the Faculty of Sharia and Law, Director of the Graduate School at UIN, Sunan Kalijaga, and Dean of the Faculty of Islamic Studies at the Indonesian International Islamic University. His research covers a broad spectrum, including Salafism, Islamic radicalism, identity politics, the Muslim middle class, religious diversity management, and youth studies. A prolific academic, Noorhaidi has contributed extensively to international journals and scholarly publications. His outstanding contributions earned him the Best Lecturer Award from Indonesia's Minister of Religion in 2015. He has also led numerous international research projects in collaboration with institutions such as Göttingen University, Radboud University, the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, and the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. In recognition of his scholarly achievements, he was appointed a member of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences in 2021. May we now invite Noorhaidi to share with us his thoughts on the on Islam in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia.
Good afternoon, everyone. His Excellencies, distinguished speakers, and honorable participants. I feel honored to be standing up here. Thank you, the organizer, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. After listening to such a fabulous speech by the President of Singapore, followed by presentations by outstanding speakers in the first two panels, we are now moving to something historical. This is about history of Islam in Indonesia, in particular, generally about Islam in Southeast Asia. The question to tackle is, to what extent does history of particular religions and its dynamics contribute to the burgeoning of multiculturalism and inclusive society? It is easier for us today to perceive religion as a barrier to the establishment of inclusive society, especially after 9/11. The framework that developed among the security observers, influence us, the way we see religions today. But in my presentation, in this session, I would argue otherwise. On the basis of my historical observation to what happened in Indonesia and tracing back to the history of the spread of Islam in that region, in that country in particular, and also the dynamic of the religion when it is intertwined with politics, social affairs, and culture. But the positive role of religion or history of religion in fostering inclusive society is contingent, to my opinion. This is contingent to the way this religion has spread out and taken its roots in particular society. The story of Islam in Indonesia is one of peaceful diffusion. This is also the same true for other Southeast Asian countries. It is through cultural accommodations and transformative social and political influence. Unlike in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, where Islam often arrived through conquest or state impositions, in Southeast Asia, the religion spread primarily through trade, intermarriage, Sufi missionary activities, and the patronage of local rulers. Over centuries, Islam adapted to local contexts, giving rise to unique cultural forms and playing a vital role in shaping governance, education, and communal relations across the region. Islam began to take root in Southeast Asia from the 12th century onward, mainly through Muslim traders from Gujarat, Persia, from the Arabian Peninsula, and later also from China. Coastal trading hubs such as Aceh and Sumatra, Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, and Ternate and Tidore in the Moluccas became important nodes in the expanding Islamic world. The key factor that made Islam appealing to local elite was kind of the fifth association with commercial prosperity. I want to emphasize here the role by Sufi missionaries in spreading Islam in the region. Sufis, in Java, for instance, we know well about the 9 saints of Java, Wali Songo, 9 wali, that we recognize as those introduced Islam to the archipelago. They come from the Sufi backgrounds and try to introduce Islam in very peaceful and syncretic way. They adopted local expressions. They try to blend the existing Buddhist and Hindu elements into Islamic expression that they introduced to the society. Look at, for instance, Sunan Kalijaga. That is the name of my own university, Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. When he was still in a young age, he was known as a kind of rebellious leader, a kind of, rebellious hero in the society, but converted to Islam, and then very active in promoting wayang, for instance, shadow puppets, as well as different kind of Javanese arts to let people know about the essence of Islam as a religion of peace. This enabled a relatively smooth and syncretic integration of Islam into Southeast Asia's religiously diverse landscape. I would argue the main characteristic of Southeast Asian Islam is Islam like this. We might call moderate Islam or whatever. We might call Indonesian Islam or whatever. But basically, the characteristic of Islam in Southeast Asia is Islam which is quite accommodative toward different cultures, toward people from different backgrounds. They bring together different expressions and blend them into one particular typical expression of Islam in this region. And the role of Sultan Agung, for instance, the second Sultan of Mataram, was quite instrumental as well in, establishing a kind of model for the integration of Islam with local culture. The kind of mystic synthesis in Java, if we borrow the term introduced by the late Professor Murray Klebs, is a kind of the main characteristic of Islam in Indonesia. And people will reject if there are some attempts to change this main characteristic. And they will try to find the new equilibrium in a time when there is a kind of, the resistance or the disturbance against this mystic synthesis type of Islam. Of course, politics also play a role in spreading Islam in the region. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Islamization process gains momentum as more local rulers converted to Islam, using their political authority to spread the faith within their courts and communities. The Sultanate of Malacca emerged as a prominent Islamic kingdom and the regional center of Islamic learning and jurisprudence. In the Indonesian archipelago, particularly Java, Islam fused with Javanese spiritual tradition to create kejawen. Kejawen is probably the closest expression of Islam to the original character of that religion in Southeast Asia. Of course, there have been some dynamic tension as well. Orthodox type of Islam also try to change this original type, but there has been always negotiation between the orthodoxy and the heterodoxy. Kejawen is a distinctive form of Islamic mysticism that retains elements of pre-Islamic cosmology. And these Islamic qualities brought significant political shift, of course. And Islam, till today, has thrives and influenced political, social, and cultural affairs in accommodative ways. Let's say, the creativity of Southeast Asian people in blending Islam from textual point of view, let's say like that, with localities, something local. They could always find the synthesis between the text and the localities. Islamic court in Java during the Sultanate period, for instance, that is not really the same with the Islamic court in the Middle East, for instance, in Persia, other regions of the Muslim world. But that is more as the Javanese Islamic court, or Islamic court which has been blended with Javanese justice, something like that, the justice system that has developed over there. The region's Islamic communities were increasingly linked to the broader Muslim world, creating a trans-regional religious identity that often transcended ethnic and linguistic divisions. But after that, we see kind of disruptions against this very typical and unique type of Southeast Asian Islam. That is the coming of colonial powers to the region. Portuguese, the Dutch, Spain as well. They came to these regions and introduced so many things, political system and everything. And colonialism certainly altered Islam's growth trajectory and somehow disturbed the main feature of Indonesian Islam. Industrializations in Java, for instance, that was brought out by the Dutch. That situation influenced the existing mystical and syncretic type of Islamic expression. Because of the changing social landscapes, political landscape, and so on and so forth. We see in the 18th century, for instance, the contestation somehow conflicts between the so-called Abangan and Putihan. Abangan refer to the red people. It is identical to the heterodox people that were very close to local culture, Hinduism and Buddhism as well. And the Putihan were associated with those who were closer to the orthodox faith of Islam. There was a tension at the time in the 18th century. But Indonesian Islam, as I say before, always know how to deal with the situation. Without too much intervention from the state, for instance, they could do it by themselves. They could resist if the orthodox fashion, try to put too much emphasis or influence on their expression of the religion. Yeah, and I would argue that the establishment of Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama in the early 20th century came as a renewal, as a renewed synthesis toward the Indonesian Islam in the Indonesian Islam. This is a kind of, they try to renew the main characteristic of Southeast Asian Islam. Of course, the Islam introduced by Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama is not exactly the same with Islam in the 15th, 16th century by Sultan Agung, for instance. But this is kind of a new synthesis. Somehow the Orthodox fashion come closer, but also the heterodox also play more role in that. So a new blend, a new synthesis of that particular religion. And we now having a new situation after the independence in the 1940s, 50s, and of course the state tried to position Islam in state affairs, and this always become big questions, how to position Islam in state affairs, whether to acknowledge as the main religion and give some political supremacy to this religion, or leave it as a cultural expression of the people. Indonesia choose Pancasila as the state foundation, ideological foundation of the country. And of course, we know some heated debates at the times about the so-called seculars and the Islamists, or those who are closer to Islam, about whether Sharia should be the basis for the new nation state, or we remain as a secular nation state. And the debate, of course, repeatedly appear in our history. But what I want to highlight is that the first principle of the Pancasila, ketuhanan yang Maha Esa, believe in one God, is a kind of affirmation to the inclusive Indonesian Islam. They do not call ketuhanan with the compulsion to perform the Sharia, for instance. but ketuhanan yang Maha Esa. So give equal space to the adherents of other religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Catholicism, and Protestantism, of course. Let me make it faster. Of course, then the state should deal with with the management of religious diversity, how to promote this framework of Pancasila. They establish a kind of national narrative around the Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unite in diversity on the basis of the Pancasila, and they try to implement the proper management of religious diversity that has been attempted through the promotion of Pancasila again, trilogy of religious harmony, if you remember about that, in the 1970s, the harmony among religious communities, within religious communities, between the religious communities and the government, and of course also various state policies aim at maintaining social cohesion, with the Ministry of Religious Affairs at the forefront. If you know Indonesia today, all the state functionaries, for instance, governor, regents, when they give speech, they always, even the president, always start with the opening greetings that bring together the greeting popular in all religions existing in Indonesia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Rahayu. This is very symbolic one, but for Indonesian, this is very important as a kind of part of the management of religious diversity. Of course, now we are having and confronting some challenges, populism, radicalism, extremism, even terrorism. But I am one who refused the thesis, popular thesis, spreading among scholars about the conservative turn. I just recently published a chapter in an edited volume, seeing that Indonesia has never been fully turning toward conservatism. Indonesia is always like that. The main equilibrium, syncretic Islam, here the orthodoxy, here and the heterodoxy. Sometimes, you know, the orthodoxy try to influence more the synthesis, and another time the heterodoxy. But once heterodoxy takes more prominent position, the heterodoxy will challenge that orthodox fashion of Islam toward the achievement of the new equilibrium. So to me, there is nothing to worry about, the dynamic of Southeast Asian Islam, in particular Indonesian Islam. Islam itself, the characteristic of Islam in this region itself, know well how to maintain the balance between different versions of Islamic expression. And by saying that, I hope that I can somehow answer the main questions proposed by the committee for this session. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Noorhaidi, for a very insightful account on the perspective of Islam in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. Now, in the morning, we didn't have much time for Q&A. Now, we have at least 30 minutes for Q&A. We have 4 questions here, and perhaps I can go straight into them, because they all pertain to the role of history. So, the first question is, many historical conflicts occurred in conditions that no longer exist. These critical historical junctures serve as a guidance, as a guidance to how we manage diversity today. Are these lessons still applicable in our new world? Let me repeat. Many historical conflicts occurred in conditions that no longer exist. These critical historical junctures serve as a guidance to how we manage diversity today. Are these lessons still applicable in our new year, in our new world? Shall we ask Noorhaidi to answer first?
Okay. Yeah, history always repeats itself, right? If we see what's going on over the last 20 years in regard with the expansion of the so-called radicalism or conservatism in the region, this is not something new. We can return to the 15th century, for instance, when traders from other part of the world came to Southeast Asia, came to Indonesia. They introduced something new to people there. Of course, at the time, there was a kind of reaction against what the migrants, traders, or whatever, brought with them to that region. And tension appeared. But as I agree in my presentation, people in Southeast Asia always know how to bring back the original version of their religious expression. Yeah, by digging up their cultural legacies or their historical background or whatever, so that they can bring back to the initial position of the religion. This has happened in the 15th, 16th century, happened again in the 18th century as a result of mounting industrialization and modernization, the coming of Hajj as well from the Middle East, more contacts with other parts of the world, and this disturbs the social, cultural, and economic equilibrium in the region. As a result, tension appear among the Santri and the Abangan, the Putihan and the Abangan. But in the 19th century, early 20th century, Muslims in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, try to find the new synthesis. I mean, not really new, but renew the synthesis of the Indonesian Islam. As I said, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. And this is the third wave of tension, I think. And the last one, just over what happened over the last 20 years with the expansion of radicalism and so on. And this is more because of the advancements of technological, digital technology, the internet and smartphone and everything. And this, of course, challenged the existing social, cultural, and political landscape in the regions, and somehow disturbed the historical equilibrium. But again, history repeats. People come back to find the original characteristic of Indonesian Islam. That is the synthesis between the Orthodox and the heterodox. On the basis of this exploration, I think we can say that, yes, conflict or whatever, that is a kind of temporary dynamics. When something happened, especially external factors came to influence and disturb the existing equilibrium in the region.
Okay, yes. Really?
I think I'm not so optimistic about this. In the context of Singapore, I would think because I think we are quite vulnerable, and what happened in history, it was under a different set of factors at that time. There are lessons that we could learn, and it's important to, in the first place, acknowledge that we should learn from history. Yet, I think we also should be mindful that not everything repeats itself. For example, a lot of things that could be done previously, I always thought, had Lee Kuan Yew been alive still, what would he deal with this issue that we have now, given that there's social media, people's reactions are quite different now. It's not so, I wouldn't say previously it was easy, but it's quite different. So we have to be mindful of that difference and should not expect that things would turn out as, so in history, it was, people responded this way, it could be contained this way, but now I think we may not be able to, we may have to think of different sets of solutions and be prepared of different reactions that will happen.
So closely linked to this question, this earlier question, is this question of what lessons can we learn from history that we can apply to promote religious harmony? What lessons can we learn from history that we can apply to promote religious harmony? I think Huay Leng has given us here. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more? Or Noorhaidi, would you like, or you think that your earlier answer has covered this question as well?
Yeah, maybe history teaches us that we don't need to be too much worried about the dynamic of religion in this.
Okay, yes,
region.
changing continuity, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like if you look at Indonesia today, there are so many cultural expressions related to religion that come up to the public sphere, something, a kind of cultural resistance against the so-called radicalism. I made my own research in two regions in Java. That is one in Wonosobo, Dieng Plateau, and the second in Magelang, early 2000s. I was there to do my research, and I found very interesting phenomenon. The so-called Abangan, identical to communist regions in the Dieng Plateau, they converted to be a Salafi village. Particularly, it's called, the name of the village is Kepakisan. Yeah, from the Abangan village, converted to be the Salafi village. Half of the population in that village become the Salafis, wearing the jalabia, letting their beards grow long, and so on. And I was wonder what happened there. And I made my observation, interview people, and actually the success of Salafis to transform the society there was because of the supportive political, economic, and cultural constellations. The New Order had the interest to make it green, that particular area, greenization by the New Order, and this gives some way for the Salafis and the preachers, conservative preachers, to introduce their version of Islam. But when I come back to that region recently, like 5 years ago, everything has changed. Salafis disappear. Only like 2-3 families remain there. Why? Because, you know, Indonesia with the democratization process and elections and PDIP, Party of Indonesian Party of Democracy struggle, PDIP, for instance, won the election there. They replaced the village head, sub-district head and region and so on. And then it changed everything there. The political, economic, social constellation changed. With that change, the constellation, the Salafis also become, you know, having no longer enough space to maintain their influence. And the second case also happened in Magelang. When I was there the first time, early 2000s, when I did my PhD research, actually, the Salafis established their buildings, their schools, their mosques and housing complex and everything. And people was sarcastically criticizing the Salafis, but they could do anything because the Salafis got support from village head and influential economic and political leaders there. But when I returned to that region like 5 years, 7 years ago, it also changed. If indeed more and more people in that region adopted jilbab, for instance, not niqab, but just Indonesian version of veil, jilbab. I was wondering whether this is the evidence of the growing influence of Salafism in that village. But the answer is no, because at the end of the day, I know well, this is part of the way people resist against the Salafis, and they become active in organizing cultural, religious events, and to say that, hi, Salafis, you don't need to teach us about the correct version of Islam. We ourselves already know how to practice Islam in our way. This is kind of cultural resistance happening in Indonesia. So this is not because of the government initiative, but cultural initiative that grow up among the people themselves. That's why I think this is the strength of Muslim in Southeast Asia. So that I'm indeed optimistic about the future about this religion.
Yes, well, now this question pertains to technology. Perhaps we can ask Huay Leng, since you're into all forms of media, right, in technology. Well, technology has enabled personal and community histories to be shared more widely. How can we weave these diverse narratives into a cohesive story that strengthens cohesion? Or will these historical narratives reinforce past grievances? Let me mention it again. Technology has enabled personal and community histories to be shared more widely. How can we weave these diverse narratives into a cohesive story that strengthens cohesion? Or will these historical narratives reinforce past grievances?
I think it's a matter of how we, to me, there are two parts of it. One, it's a lot, we have online, we have archives. This is one form of media as well. You have films that's made out of maybe interviews, imagination, whatever. Because I'm a journalist, I think I am very particular about checking with facts as much as we can to understand from various people what happened, for example, on history. And then we make our judgment and we understand what to make out of something, right? So expressing or understanding history, I think with technology, it helps a lot in you can deliver it to more people. There are more channels to do that. But it can also be misinformation sometimes if you didn't get the facts correct. So I would think going back to factual is important. Of course, there's nothing that's objective, or we don't know what exactly facts are sometimes. So you have to exercise a lot of judgment and caution on that. But definitely, I think we can actually see, in Singapore's history, for example, there are things that the ministries are doing, institutions are doing to help you understand your own history, personal history, for example, family histories. I think a lot of all this has also got people more interested in their families, their schools, the communities, and all that. But I think we have to be thinking. We have to be thinking consumers of such information, and also to be thinking producers of such information.
Consumers and producers. Yes, in relation to technology again, perhaps this one we can address to Noorhaidi. In what ways can interfaith dialogue incorporate shared heritage to create inclusive digital spaces for the younger generation?
Yeah.
In what ways can interfaith dialogue incorporate shared heritage to create inclusive digital spaces for the younger generation?
Yes.
Can I intercept also? Just now you mentioned
go ahead.
the future challenges, right?
Yeah.
You had one on youth and digital society. So the demand may be different. Maybe you didn't have time to elaborate on that.
Yeah,
Could you?
Yes. Yes, first of all, I want to say that the expansion of digital technology confirmed my optimistic view about the future of religion in this region. You see, with the digital technology, no one single party can control and dominate the public space. There has been always competition. Everybody can involve in interpreting religion. If you see that radicals somehow try to control the public space through the digital technology, apparently the answer, at the end of the day, they fail to do that. Of course, on some a certain period of time, they can be quite prominent, but because of the openness of technology, the moderates, people from different backgrounds can also involve and give different expressions and interpretation of Islam in the case of Indonesia, for instance. That's why the public space become achieving, its equilibrium by itself through the openness of the digital technology. Of course, we need to accelerate the achievement of the balance in the public space of the digital media by encouraging younger actors to be involved in promoting their ideas, their interests in the public space. And I think Indonesia has been quite successful in, encouraging civil society actors, also among young people, to express themselves. Desa Damai, for instance, by the Wahid Institute is quite instrumental. Some foundations have been established to share their expression about Islam, but not using very, orthodox version of teaching religion. This is sometimes they use cartoon. They use youth expressions, something very popular from pop culture. They combine. But of course, to get the legitimacy from the religion itself, they need to quote some texts from the religion. But we do not need to be worried about that, because even though they quote some text, for instance, the text has been negotiated and given new meaning for the younger generation. Religious moderation by the Ministry of Religious Affairs is also instrumental, now followed by the Curriculum of Love by the current Minister of Religious Affairs. But small initiatives in almost all parts of Indonesia that have been developing, especially among youth, I think play a pivotal role in bringing back the equilibrium of Indonesian Islam.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Let me add. I think even for the Chinese community, I would say it's not very advanced technology, but at least now that we have website and all that, we see that, for example, Singapore Chinese Center for Singapore Chinese Cultural Center, they have recently, with the support of MCCY, did a Culturepedia. It's a project whereby they put up history, culture of different aspects of the Chinese community online in both English and Chinese language. that helps in understand for the others to understand, and even for young people to understand about the Chinese community and the culture, what happened before. And I think this is just the first phase of it, that somebody has to first do the research, and then you put it up there. And the second phase, probably with that, with all this research, somebody can tell a better story out of it, and they can produce other forms of media. They can do a film, a short film, or whatever, cartoon, or so, based on what has been researched. I think that also helps a lot.
Yes, the different sources, the different ways of understanding history. This question goes, many countries promote shared national values based on key historical events to foster unity. To what extent have such narratives been effective in bringing people together across differences? What other ways are used to foster a shared sense of belonging? So perhaps here we can comment a little bit about the historical aspects of it, and then bringing the discussion to the present and to the future in terms of how can nations anchor on common national legacies for the future, and what are the conditions that have enabled multicultural societies to be optimistic and cohesive. So looking back to the past, bringing it to the future, and perhaps thinking how the future, bringing it to the present and thinking about how the future would go. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Me? Okay. Yeah, of course there are some conditions for social cohesion and inclusivity, but this is our homework for the future, I think, especially for a country like Indonesia, which is still struggling for economic betterment. It's not that easy, right, to deal with the condition for social cohesion. Like, there must be inclusive institutions, the institution that allow people from all backgrounds to be participating in making decisions, and also getting access to anything, politics, economy, and so on. And this is our challenge indeed. And then also civic education and pluralist narratives. We still need to deal with this, and we need to struggle for the better civic education. Sometimes the government, introduce some strategies, but not always essential and substantial. Sometimes, if it is from the government, because based on the state policy, for instance, sometimes that the initiative remain like something sloganistic. Yeah, religious moderation, for instance. That is very good as a slogan, as a kind of the call for the people to join this action. But to what extent this kind of initiative really, make people aware about their rights to be part of the nation-state fellows and so on. Equitable development, also very important as a condition for social cohesion. And for a country like Singapore, this is not a big deal, I think. It's, a very developed country, but for Indonesia, we are still struggling to achieve, to get out from the middle income trap, $6,000. And I remember my discussions a long time ago with Professor Branton when I was joining Asia Research Institute in the US, that he reminded me that of the importance of GDP for social cohesion in a society. If it is still less than 6,000, it is quite vulnerable indeed. That is why Indonesia is struggling to achieve, above $6,000. And then pluralist religious framework is also important, and civil society and independent media. Civil society, very important. In Indonesia, we have, fortunately, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah and academics, people at the grassroots always remind Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama of the importance of to be independent. so that they can express their critical views and their critics, again, what happened at the state level, for instance. But yeah, recently there have been debates over mining, the involvement of religious organization in mining. But yeah, that is something problematic that we believe as academic, for instance, and civil society people, that this kind of organizations, civil society, religious organization, they need to be independent and critical to the state, to maintain equitable development and so on that we expect. Yeah, and the last one is actually what I want to say in my presentation, but I had limited time, is that about we need to reframe interfaith harmony as justice and nation building, not just we bring together people and let them discuss about tolerance, for instance. This is not enough. Tolerance become quite symbolic and sloganistic some way, but how to reframe interfaith harmony as justice? If you uphold interfaith harmony, it means that you also respect about justice, equal access to economic, politics, and so on. This is very hard, very difficult to do, of course, but we need to do something. We need to say something about this to reframe interfaith harmony as justice and nation building. And policy reform need to be taken into account as well, and grassroots engagement in different ways, as well as the role of religious leaders in peace building, and it is still really needed to maintain the social harmony in the society.
Yes, Huay Leng.
I think for Singapore, because we have a very short history since 1965, the historical conflict that's always talked about, it's the racial riots. I didn't cover, but I think a lot of Singaporeans, we are very much aware of this. But we can't keep going back to talking about just the racial riots. It's for us to remember, and apart from that, actually, the lesson is that it's this coexistence, or in fact, we have to respect each other's religion, culture, and that's important. And through that, actually, the other part of it that we keep hearing, actually, it's what's happening outside of Singapore, which are being used as lessons for us to remember and to learn, because what happened in other parts of the world, the racial riots or religious conflicts, that will actually impact us, because some of our fellow citizens, they are concerned with what's happening outside of Singapore. So they will respond to that as well. So there's a lot of we are very much intertwined with what's happening outside of Singapore. Even for this, I think it's also part of our national education that we are very much aware of, and it's quite important for us to learn from that and to be very conscious that we should avoid bringing it into Singapore.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. And this question also sort of round up the topic for this breakout session. Couldn't history provide both the navigations and barrier constraints necessary for a more inclusive and realistic future? Couldn't history provide both the navigations and barrier constraints necessary for a more inclusive and realistic future?
Yes, I said before, history provided a lot of lessons for us, and we cannot change history, right? That is why we believe what happened in last century and before could be taken as a lessons to deal with the future. But what we need today is to consolidate ourselves, to dig up the historical legacy, in order for us to see better future, we have to be optimistic, I think. If there are so many reasons to be optimistic, history, one of it teach us about that. If we are too pessimistic about the future, I think no space for us to be creative, to be, thinking about the historical legacy that can be taken as a model for future engagement. And if Southeast Asia is to thrive, economically, politically, and socially, I believe it must commit to building cohesive societies where religious diversity is celebrated, not feared. And as a speaker, I look forward to exchanging ideas and exploring solutions with thought leaders, policymakers, and young change makers from across the region. So, yeah, optimism is very important, I think, for the future.
I certainly agree with that. It's the question actually. It's whether people still value history that much beyond this room. People will be asking how much can history fetch us, right? So whether people are actually interested in history in the past, that is actually, I have a big question mark now. Everybody is looking at technology and future. The question is how we can make history more interesting for people to be willing to learn from it and to tell history in a more interesting and exciting way.
Well, before closing, perhaps just a few thoughts of my own on this topic. Yes, the significance of history in the context of social cohesion and multiculturalism. Well, history is not just a record of the past, but it is a script for the way that we live today. So in understanding history, in order to understand history, we need to understand history is to identify where we come from. Is to understand where we come from. Is to understand our identity. And our identity evolves over time. So throughout history, for instance, pre-colonial times to nationhood, what are the changes that have arisen from this evolution of history and how that impacts on our identity? And with the onset of nationhood, there's the need, particularly in multicultural societies like Indonesia and Singapore, to bring people together. And in these two societies, the ideal is the framework is that of multiculturalism. And again, when we talk about the experience of multiculturalism in the post-independence times, the more complex voices that we hear, the more polarities that we talk about earlier on, of different segments of the population, how they view multiculturalism, how they were affected by it, the majority populations, the minority populations, in terms of social classes, in terms of gender, in terms of generational aspects. How can we learn at each stage that we implement certain policies regarding to multiculturalism? By listening more to all these complex voices, we can better evaluate the strategies that we use for that particular period and then move on to current times. And of course, as times change, continuity and change being a hallmark of history, we bear all these lessons in mind and proceed from where we are. And in the context of multiculturalism and social cohesion, of course, the diversity of historical narratives is only one perspective. And what we need to do is actually to build up an ecosystem of multiculturalism, ecosystem that encompasses all aspects of society in terms of inclusivity, in terms of equality, in terms of access to opportunities, in terms of equity. So these features of inclusion in the various aspects, political aspects, sound governments, fair institutions, economic opportunities, economic capacity, social services, social integration, cultural expressions that mirror the diversity of society, All this will help in bringing about this ecosystem of multiculturalism. So from the pillars of multiculturalism, we operationalize it through the framework of inclusion. And if we do that well, then we have social cohesion, and when such themes are normalized, when we see people as individuals worthy of respect in whatever way we are, then we deepen social cohesion, and that brings about social resilience. So perhaps on that note, we can end. Yep. Well, thank you very much.